Every year, 22 million people visit Boston. They walk the Freedom Trail. They take photos at Faneuil Hall. They stand where the Boston Tea Party happened and feel connected to American history. Tour guides tell them about revolutionaries fighting tyranny, about founding fathers demanding liberty. Boston sells itself as the birthplace of American freedom, the city that said no to oppression, the place where democracy was born. But there's a trail these tourists never walk. A neighborhood that isn't on any map they'll see. A story that isn't part of the official narrative. Between 1956 and 1960, the city of Boston removed 20,000 people from their homes. Not because of a natural disaster, not because of war, because city planners looked at a thriving neighborhood and decided it needed to disappear. They called it urban renewal. The residents called it something else. They called it theft. The West End was 48 square blocks of Boston. Immigrant families had lived there for generations. Jewish tailors, Italian restaurant owners, Irish shopkeepers, Syrian bakers. This wasn't some forgotten corner of the city. It was 10 minutes from downtown. You could see the State House dome from the front steps. And in 1958, bulldozers turned those 48 blocks into rubble. 2,700 apartments became dust. Businesses that had been there for 50 years closed in a single afternoon. Churches where families had been baptized, married and buried, were demolished in weeks. Here's what makes it worse. This wasn't a slum in any meaningful sense of that word. 70% of West End residents owned their homes. The crime rate was below the city average. Buildings were well maintained. Families knew their neighbors. Kids played in the streets. But the city needed language that would justify what was coming. So they found it. Blight. Deterioration. Slums. Words that transformed human beings into problems that needed solutions. And the solution was simple. Make them disappear. Today, if you walk through that part of Boston, you'll see luxury high-rises. Charles River Park. Modern apartment towers with floor-to-ceiling windows, doormen, granite lobbies. The kind of place where one-bedroom apartments rent for $4,000 a month. There's a small museum now, opened in 2015, 57 years after the demolition. A handful of photos on the wall, some stories preserved on video, but no monuments, no memorials, nothing that would interrupt the clean lines of the new neighborhood or make tourists uncomfortable. The city that built its identity on resisting oppression spent 3 years systematically erasing a community of its own residents. And they did it in the name of progress. But who were these people? The ones whose homes became parking lots, whose businesses became lobby floors, whose memories were buried under concrete. Before we talk about how it happened, before we examine who decided and who profited, we need to understand what was actually there. Not the version city officials wrote in their reports, not the word blight repeated in newspapers until it sounded like fact. The real West End, the one that 20,000 people called home. The place that existed before the maps were redrawn, and the street names were changed, and the entire neighborhood was transformed into something its own residents couldn't afford to return to. Because once you see what was actually there, once you understand who these people were and what they built, the word renewal starts to sound like exactly what it was: a lie. Leonard had been cutting fabric on Cambridge Street for 40 years, third-generation tailor. His grandfather came from Poland in 1892, opened the shop in 1920, taught Leonard's father the trade, who taught Leonard. By 1955, Leonard knew every family within 6 blocks. He knew whose son was getting married, whose daughter needed a dress for graduation, whose father had passed and needed a suit for the funeral. He didn't advertise. He didn't need to. In the West End, you didn't find businesses through the yellow pages. You knew them because they'd been there your entire life, because your parents knew them, because the building itself was part of the neighborhood's memory. 3 blocks down, Rita ran a restaurant her grandmother had started in 1903. The family came from Naples. The recipes came with them. Sunday gravy that simmered for 8 hours. Ravioli made fresh every morning at 5 a.m. The smell of garlic and tomatoes filled the entire block by 7. Customers didn't call ahead. They just showed up, knew there'd be a table, knew Rita would remember how they liked their coffee. The walls were covered in photos. Weddings, confirmations, baptisms. 50 years of the neighborhood's life documented in black and white frames. Rita's daughter was learning to make the sfogliatelle the same way Rita had learned from her mother. The same recipe, the same kitchen, the same wooden board where the dough was rolled. 4 generations in one room. 8 blocks away, Marcus cut hair in a shop that didn't officially exist in any city record, because the building it occupied had been built without permits in 1938 by a man who needed workspace and didn't have time to wait for bureaucracy. Marcus was one of the few black barbers in Boston who had white customers and black customers sitting in the same chairs, waiting in the same line, reading the same newspapers while they waited. In most of Boston in the 1950s, that didn't happen. The West End was different. Not perfect, not some utopian dream, but different. Marcus had customers who'd been coming to him for 20 years. He knew their kids. He'd watched them grow up. When they came back from the war in Korea, Marcus was the first person they saw when they wanted to feel like they were home. This was the West End. Not the version written in urban planning documents that used words like congested and deteriorated and substandard housing. The real version. 48 different nationalities living in 48 blocks. You could walk down one street and hear Yiddish, Italian, Arabic, Greek, Polish, and English all before you reached the corner. Bakeries where the bread was still warm at 6 in the morning. Corner stores where you could buy on credit because the owner knew you'd pay on Friday when you got your check. Synagogues and Catholic churches and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church all within walking distance of each other. The buildings weren't modern. They were brick walk-ups built in the 1800s, some of them. Narrow staircases, radiators that clanked, windows that didn't quite close all the way in winter. But they were maintained. People painted their stoops, replaced broken windows, fixed leaking roofs, because these weren't rental properties owned by distant landlords. 70% of West End residents owned their homes. They had legal deeds. They paid property taxes. They had equity. They had something to pass down to their children. The crime rate in the West End was lower than the citywide average. School attendance was higher. There were 3 settlement houses that provided services to families. A library. Parks where kids played stickball. This wasn't some blighted wasteland. This was a neighborhood, a functioning, living, breathing community where people had built lives, raised families, created businesses, established roots that went back generations. And in 1953, men in suits began showing up with clipboards and cameras, taking notes, measuring buildings, marking things on maps that residents weren't allowed to see. That was the first sign. The beginning of the end that nobody quite understood yet. Because how could you understand that someone was measuring your home, your business, your entire world, and deciding it was worth less than the empty space it would become? The official announcement came in April of 1956. The mayor held a press conference. Urban planners stood behind him with architectural renderings of what the West End would become: modern housing, green spaces, a new vision for Boston. The newspapers printed the renderings on the front page: glass towers, wide streets, clean lines. The Boston Globe called it bold and necessary. The Herald praised the city's commitment to progress. In the articles, the West End was described as blighted, deteriorated, beyond repair. None of the reporters had apparently walked those streets recently, or if they had, they'd already decided what they were supposed to see. What the mayor didn't mention in that press conference was that the federal government was funding 75% of the demolition costs through the Housing Act of 1949. What he didn't mention was that real estate developers had already purchased adjacent land, betting on the neighborhood's removal. What he didn't mention was that the people who lived there hadn't been consulted, hadn't been asked, hadn't been given any say in whether their homes should be classified as problems that needed solving. The decision had been made in rooms they weren't invited to, by men who'd never shopped at Rita's restaurant, or had their suits tailored by Leonard, or gotten their hair cut by Marcus. Men who saw the West End as empty space on a map, potential rather than place, numbers on a balance sheet rather than someone's grandmother's kitchen where 4 generations had learned to make bread. Leonard tried to organize resistance. He held meetings in the back of his tailor shop. 200 families signed a petition. They hired a lawyer, filed an injunction, argued that the city's classification of the neighborhood as blighted was inaccurate, that the majority of buildings were structurally sound, that residents were property owners with legal rights. The case went to court in February of 1957. The judge ruled against them. The city had authority under state urban renewal laws to designate areas for redevelopment. Ownership didn't matter. Structural integrity didn't matter. The decision had been made, and the law supported it. Rita closed her restaurant for 1 day in protest. March 15, 1957. A Thursday. She put a sign in the window explaining why. 7 other businesses on her block did the same. The Boston Globe didn't cover it. The Herald didn't mention it. It was as if the protest had never happened, as if the silence was already practicing for the complete erasure that was coming. The first eviction notices arrived in April of 1958, 90 days to vacate. The letters were formal, bureaucratic, impersonal. They didn't acknowledge that these were homes, that families had lived here for decades, that businesses had served the community for generations. The letters provided information about relocation assistance. There were forms to fill out, office hours listed for questions, but the core message was simple and non-negotiable: leave. Leonard received his notice on April 22nd. He was 58 years old. The building where he worked wasn't just his business. He lived in the apartment upstairs. Everything he owned was in those 2 spaces. 40 years of customer records. Bolts of fabric his father had bought in the 1930s. The sewing machine his grandfather brought from Poland. He tried to find another location. Looked at storefronts in other neighborhoods. But the rent was triple what he'd been paying, and his customers were in the West End. Without them, without that location, the business didn't make sense. In June, he watched the demolition begin 3 blocks away. The sound of the machinery carried. You could hear it from his shop. The crash of brick and wood, the grinding of debris, getting closer. Rita was offered $4,200 for her building. The city's appraiser determined that was fair market value for a deteriorated structure in a blighted area. She'd inherited the building free and clear. Her family had owned it for 54 years. $4,200. She refused. In August, the police came with the final eviction order. She had 72 hours. She took what she could carry. The photos from the walls. Her grandmother's recipes written in Italian on cards that were falling apart. The wooden board for the dough. The restaurant was demolished on September 9th, 1958. The rubble was cleared by September 15th. 6 days to erase 55 years. Marcus tried to relocate his barber shop to Roxbury. Found a small space, moved his chairs, put up his sign. But his customers from the West End couldn't get there easily. No direct bus line. Too far to walk. The new neighborhood didn't know him. Business dropped by 80% in the first month. He closed in March of 1959, 6 months after opening. He'd been cutting hair in Boston for 19 years. Now, he couldn't afford to stay. By 1960, it was finished. 2,700 apartments gone. Hundreds of businesses closed. 20,000 people displaced. The streets where Leonard and Rita and Marcus had built their lives were rubble. Then empty lots. Then construction sites for towers none of them could afford to live in. Charles River Park opened in 1962. Luxury apartments. Market rate starting at $180 a month, which was triple what most West End residents had been paying. Only 5% of the original residents had income levels that qualified them to return. The others scattered. Somerville, Cambridge, Dorchester. Some left Boston entirely. The community that had existed for generations dissolved in less than 3 years, and the city called it renewal. The West End wasn't unique. That's the part that makes it worse. What happened in Boston between 1956 and 1960 wasn't some isolated mistake, some unfortunate case of civic planning gone wrong in one city. It was a blueprint. The Housing Act of 1949 gave federal money to cities across America for what was officially called slum clearance and urban renewal. Between 1950 and 1970, that money was used in 993 cities. Conservative estimates suggest that over 1 million people were displaced during those 2 decades. 63% of them were Black, Latino, or recent immigrants. This wasn't happening by accident. This was policy. Even within Boston, the West End was just the most complete erasure. Scollay Square disappeared in 1962. It had been the city's entertainment district since the 1860s. Theaters, restaurants, bars, hotels. Working-class people went there. Sailors on leave. Students. Immigrants. The buildings were old, yes. Some dated back to before the Civil War. But old didn't mean dead. Businesses were operating. People were working. Then the city decided it needed a government center. Modern, clean, official. Scollay Square was demolished. In its place, they built Boston City Hall, a concrete brutalist structure that looks like it's trying to intimidate you. The neighborhood's name was erased from maps. If you search for Scollay Square today, you'll find historical photos and nostalgia blogs. You won't find the square. The New York Streets neighborhood went in 1967. Syrian and Lebanese families had been there since the 1880s. Small grocers, import shops, community centers. The city needed to expand the hospital district. The families were given notice. The buildings came down. The community scattered. There's a hospital there now. No plaque mentioning what came before. But Boston was just following a pattern that was playing out everywhere. In Detroit, 2 neighborhoods called Black Bottom and Paradise Valley were demolished in the 1950s. 12,000 families displaced. These weren't struggling areas. Black Bottom had the highest rate of black homeownership in Detroit. Paradise Valley had jazz clubs, theaters, businesses that had survived the Depression. The city built a highway through it, Interstate 75. If you drive that stretch today, you're driving over what used to be living rooms, churches, the practice spaces where jazz musicians who later became famous learned their craft. San Francisco targeted the Fillmore district, which had been called the Harlem of the West. During World War II, when Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps, black families moved into the Fillmore. They built businesses, established churches, created a cultural center. By the 1960s, it was a thriving neighborhood. The city saw blight. Over 20,000 people were displaced between 1960 and 1975. Today, the Fillmore is boutique shops and expensive condos. Less than 10% of the neighborhood's black population remains. Chicago demolished Maxwell Street in phases starting in the 1950s and finishing in the 1990s. Jewish immigrants had been there since the 1880s. It was the oldest open-air market in America. Musicians played on street corners. Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf both played Maxwell Street before they were famous. You could buy anything there. Household goods, musical instruments, food from every culture that had settled in Chicago. The University of Illinois wanted to expand. The market was in the way. The market lost. The language was always the same. Slum clearance, urban renewal, blight removal, progress. These words appeared in city council meetings from Boston to Los Angeles. They appeared in federal documents, in newspaper editorials, in architectural journals, and they always meant the same thing. Clear out the poor, clear out the immigrants, clear out the black and brown families. Make room for highways, universities, government buildings, luxury housing. Call it improvement, call it modernization. Never call it what it actually was, which was the systematic dismantling of communities that had taken generations to build. Decided by men who never lived in those neighborhoods, who never shopped in those stores, who never understood that what looked like blight on their maps was someone's home, someone's livelihood, someone's entire world. The people making these decisions were uniformly white, uniformly male, uniformly from elsewhere. They looked at neighborhoods full of languages they didn't speak, foods they didn't eat, religious practices they didn't share, and they saw disorder. They saw something that didn't match their vision of what an American city should look like. And because they had the power, they erased it. Not with the honesty of saying, "We want this land for something else, and we have the power to take it." They did it with paperwork, with classifications, with terms like substandard housing applied to buildings that were maintained and occupied and loved. They made it official. They made it legal. They made it sound inevitable, like these neighborhoods were dying anyway, and they were simply speeding up a natural process. But there was nothing natural about it. Every single demolition was a choice. Every displacement was deliberate. Every community that disappeared did so because someone decided it should, and had the authority to make that decision real. So, what's left of the West End today? Physically, almost nothing. There's one street, Lomasney Way, 3 blocks long. It survived because it was at the edge of the demolition zone, not worth the effort to remove. Everything else is gone. The buildings where Leonard and Rita and Marcus lived and worked are luxury apartments now. The synagogues are parking garages. The corner stores are lobbies with granite counters and doormen. If you didn't know to look for it, you'd never know anything had been there before. In 2015, 57 years after the demolition, a small museum opened, the West End Museum. It's in a storefront, one room, maintained by volunteers. There are photographs on the walls, black and white images of streets that don't exist anymore. Oral history recordings from former residents, most of them recorded in the 1990s and 2000s, decades after they'd been displaced, their voices older, their memories fighting against time. There are artifacts, a sign from a butcher shop, menus from restaurants, pieces of buildings salvaged before everything became rubble. It's open limited hours. It doesn't charge admission. Most tourists walking through that part of Boston never know it's there. In 2018, the city installed a small memorial plaque near the corner of Lomasney Way and Causeway Street, 60 years after the demolition. The plaque acknowledges that the West End was home to a diverse and vibrant community, and that the urban renewal project resulted in the displacement of residents and the loss of neighborhood character. That's the language. Not destroyed, not erased. Displacement and loss of character. Think as if character is something that can be misplaced, like keys or a wallet, rather than something that was deliberately demolished with bulldozers and replaced with structures designed for people who could afford to never think about who'd been there before. The city issued an official acknowledgement in 2015. Not an apology, an acknowledgement. They recognized that the urban renewal project had caused hardship for former residents. There was no compensation offered. No reparations. No fund established to support the scattered families or their descendants. Just acknowledgement that yes, this happened, and yes, it was difficult for the people it happened to. 57 years late, and carefully worded to avoid any implication of legal liability. Leonard never opened another tailor shop. He moved to Somerville, worked in a factory that made industrial fabrics until he retired. He attended the West End reunions every year until he couldn't anymore. He passed away in 1994. He was 82. In one of the oral histories recorded before he died, he said that he still dreamed about the shop sometimes, that he'd wake up thinking he needed to get to work, that he had suits to finish, and then he'd remember that the shop didn't exist anymore, that the street it had been on didn't exist anymore, that the building had been gone for 35 years. Rita worked in a textile factory in Dorchester until she retired. She never opened another restaurant. She kept her grandmother's recipes, taught them to her daughter, but they never tasted the same, she said. Different kitchen, different neighborhood, different customers. The recipes needed the context to work. In an interview recorded in 2008, she said she tried to make the Sunday gravy once, years after the restaurant closed, and halfway through she started crying and had to stop. She couldn't explain why. Just that something about the smell, the process, reminded her of everything that was gone. Marcus left Boston in 1965, moved back south, Atlanta, opened a barber shop there, but it wasn't the same. Different customers, different neighborhood, different rhythms. He told his family that he'd lost something in Boston that he couldn't get back. He passed away in 2003. His children didn't understand what he meant about the West End until much later, until they were adults, and they started researching what had happened, why their father had left Boston so abruptly, why he never wanted to go back. Today, if you take a tour of Boston, if you walk the Freedom Trail, or take a duck boat, or follow a guide in colonial costume, you'll pass through the area where the West End used to be. The tours mention the TD Garden, where the Celtics and Bruins play. They mention the Museum of Science nearby. They mention the history of the neighborhood in the 1800s, the workers who built the infrastructure of early Boston. But they don't mention 1958. They don't mention Leonard or Rita or Marcus. They don't mention the 2,700 families who were told their homes were problems that needed solving. The tours move through quickly. There's nothing to see there, Nothing that indicates this was ever anything other than what it is now. Modern, clean, expensive, empty of history. Boston built its entire identity on resisting tyranny, on demanding freedom, on standing up to power that claimed authority it hadn't earned. The Freedom Trail takes you past sites where colonists protested taxation without representation, where they fought against being told what to do by people who didn't live among them and didn't understand their lives. And that trail passes within blocks of where the city did exactly what it claims to have always opposed. Decided that a community was inconvenient, that the people there didn't fit the vision, that progress was more important than the lives that would be displaced in its name. They did it with paperwork instead of soldiers, with urban planning documents instead of tax laws, but the result was the same. People who had built lives, who owned property, who had legal rights, lost everything because someone with more power decided they should. The next time you're in Boston, if you walk through Charles River Park, understand that you're walking through a cemetery of a different kind. Not bodies, but memories. Not graves, but foundations that used to hold homes where families lived for generations. The buildings are beautiful, modern glass and clean lines, but they stand on ground that was taken, on streets that were erased, over the remnants of a community that 20,000 people knew as home, and that was removed so thoroughly that most people don't even know it existed. That's not renewal. That's erasure. And the fact that it happened in the city that sells itself as the birthplace of American freedom should tell you something about whose freedom we've always been talking about, and whose has never really mattered at all.